Hi everybody. Well, welcome again to Educational Psychology, EDU, Psych 401. This PowerPoint is an outline and an overview of Chapter 1. So we'll begin with some guiding questions. So really, what is educational psychology, what is critical thinking, and how do educational psychologists use theory and research? These are all questions we'll seek to answer throughout this chapter and beyond. So, and also, which research methods are popular in educational psychology and what's the purpose of each? We'll look at those briefly. How can teachers and researchers narrow the gap between theory and practice? And this is going to be an important aspect of trying to look at this question and come up with a solution for this, because oftentimes practice and theory are not connected. And that's where we run into some difficulties. What is reflective teaching, and how does one become a more reflective teacher? So here's the overview of the chapter, looking at educational psychology in the broad sense, and theories and research, narrowing the gap, and reflective teaching. Okay. So what is educational psychology? Well, there are two objectives here, as you can see on the screen. But beyond that, it's really to understand learners and to foster learning. Our knowledge of educational psychology really equips us well to understand the learners in our classrooms, and there's a diversity of learners. So one theory doesn't always fit every child. The goals of educational psychology is to understand what teachers do, how students learn, and how teachers help students learn. So understanding EdPsych gives you a toolbox of instructional strategies that will help you understand why some approaches to instruction are more effective than others. And if you think back to your own experience in school, or even your current experience in school, think about whether those teachers understood educational psychology or not. Well, I'm going to ask you to kind of keep your own experiences in mind as we go through this course. And then we have to look carefully at critical thinking and reflective teaching, because they go hand in hand with effective teaching. So the process of critical thinking is really, being able to tell fact from opinion, seeing holes in a logic, and so forth and so on. You can read the slide. I don't need to read it for you. The claims about what works in education need to be evaluated, because there are a lot of people out there making a lot of claims, and we have to we can't buy these things wholesale. We have to look at them critically. Is it research-based? Is it an opinion? Is it subjective, objective? Educational research and educational psychology research in particular asks the question, okay, and then attempts to answer it in a research-based scientific method. A subjective ways of knowing may be okay, but it's not a scientific method. So simply saying that this instructional practice or classroom strategy works isn't enough. We need to really look to see, does it really work? Has someone tested it, and so forth and so on. Many of our classrooms are run on instinct, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I think instinct will serve us well in lots of situations, but we have to know the theories and the psychology behind what we do and why we do it. So educational psychology is a field that's built from objective, data-based evidence. Okay, so it's objective rather than subjective. So when we test our subjective understanding, sometimes our stance is confirmed. Sometimes, yes, see, I told you I was right. But oftentimes our stance is challenged in some way, and oftentimes contradicted, and sometimes just rejected out of hand. So it's important that we test our ideas through the research process. And if we don't do it ourselves, we need to look and see what others have done, and so we can help us to get the answers to these questions. Okay, so as a field of study, there are these two missions here. Enhance theoretical knowledge and improve educational practice, and apply scientifically based research methods to collect data. The first one, for me, is the most important one. There's no sense in conducting educational research unless it's going to help us improve our educational practice and help us to build theory, okay? And we do that through scientifically based research. We often hear many claims about education and the effectiveness of education, but we really need to look at the data behind the claims. This is where reflection and critical thinking come in, okay? Okay, very, very important. Okay, so what is learning? Here's a definition for you: a relatively permanent change in knowledge, skill, or behavior or knowledge as a result of experiences. And as this slide notes, it depends on many factors: the quality of the instruction, the motivation of the student, the engagement of the student, and the student's developmental readiness to learn. So we have to take all of those things into consideration as we build our practice. So really, what is a theory? If we look here at what a theory really, I skipped a slide, sorry about that. So I'm just going to, instead of going back, I'm just going to verbalize what was on this previous slide. A theory is an intellectual framework that organizes a vast amount of knowledge about a phenomena so that educators can understand and explain better the nature of that phenomena. It sounds kind of a mouthful to say, but I think it'll become clearer as we go through. It explains how something works, and it helps teachers to create a hypothesis or a prediction, gives us new insight, and it guides more research studies. And here's where this is, again, as I noted earlier, linking theory to practice, okay? Linking theoretical constructs and apply them in a critical way to the practice of teaching. We're going to be learning a lot of the various learning theories throughout this course. We don't have to buy every one, wholesale, but we need to understand what they are and be able to know when to apply these theories and when not to apply these theories. A good philosophy of education really melds many different philosophies together depending on the situation, the students, the climate, motivation, and so forth and so on. On pages 6 and 7 in Chapter 1, there's some nice examples of what is theory. I'd ask you to look at that carefully. I'm not going to go over it here on the slide, but I am pointing you to those 2 pages to get a good sense of what theory looks like in those 2 examples. Okay, so then I'm going to shift gears a little bit and kind of think about the different methods that are used to research various things. So there are descriptive studies, correlational studies, experimental studies, and action studies. Descriptive studies are just what it says. It's when a researcher describes an educational situation as it naturally occurs. Okay, so it's what typically happens, how teachers teach, and how students learn and develop. So it's observation and description. An example might be, what are the most common strategies teachers use to motivate and engage their students? Okay. Relational studies is relational. Okay, so is looking at the relationship between two naturally occurring variables. Okay, and being able to summarize the nature and magnitude of the relation in numerical form. This is a very statistical-based research methodology. Experimental studies, and this looks for cause and effect. So the example here is, says exposure to violent video games cause an increase in adolescents' peer aggression. So cause and effect. Action research. Action research is the type of research that teachers carry out in their own classrooms to inform and improve their classroom practice. So it's a teacher forming a question about a problem or a question about something he or she wishes to know, and then conducting that research in the classroom. Generally, it's qualitative, which means it's by observation, by taking notes, by being very alert to the question that you're asking. So, for example, how do my middle school science students use the textbook? Okay, that will have to do with really looking carefully at what's going on and looking at it with a different set of eyes than just in a classroom practice. So, how does one go about conducting research, action research? You identify a problem, you formulate a plan to address the problem, you collect and analyze data to see if the plan worked, you reflect on it, and then you use the new and improved personal theory of teaching and repeat those steps until a significant positive change in the problem is observed. So if one conducts research in a classroom about understanding how students use their textbook, you'd collect the data, you'd reflect on what you've learned, and then you would do something different in the classroom, and then test that to see if that works. So here's an example, and I'll give you the answer slide in a moment, but take a second to look at these 4 and think about what is the kind of research that's going on here, okay? So I want to decide if boys in the 6th grade benefit more from cooperative learning than girls. Okay, so now we're experimenting. This is experimental. I want to decide if completion of homework is associated with better achievement. Correlation. I want to examine the number of errors present in the 8th grade science book. Descriptive. I want Maria to tell me about her experiences in solving a math problem. Action research. And here are the answers. Okay, I'm going to switch gears one more time and talk about reflective teaching. So technical teaching is the kind of teaching that relies on routine knowledge and tried and true solutions to manage classroom problems. It's the craft of teaching rather than the art of teaching. That's kind of how I like to look at it. But reflective teaching involves generating conjectures to explain a surprising or negative event, then gathering information needed to make a decision. This is so important in a classroom, being able to look beyond what you always do as tried and true, and having that sort of, openness and questioning attitude every time you approach a lesson. And here's a little bit more information in terms of what that might look like. Classroom experience, constructive learning experience, knowledge about the teaching and learning situation, constructive learning experience. So there are three levels of reflection. In the first one, in the technical teaching, it's imitating teaching behavior that one has observed or how one was taught, So a teacher who enters a classroom and teaches the same way he or she was taught in school is really doing technical teaching, all right? If one is emulating somebody else is technical teaching, okay? But then we look at thoughtful action. So the thoughtful action really asks the question, why? The teacher analyzes classroom events and looks for relationships between things, so always thinking and always looking. But then the highest level, and it doesn't mean we can't incorporate all of these levels of reflection, but that highest level is really the reflective teaching, where the teacher analyzes from multiple perspectives, understands how one impacts student learning, and looks for ways to change and improve. So sometimes we may do technical teaching, where it's the tried and true. Other times we're looking at it with a more thoughtful eye, and then on that third level, we're really looking to find ways of changing practice to make it better for the students in front of us. Okay, reflection for action. On page 22, and excuse me a minute while I turn to that page, you'll get some nice graphics here, for reflection and action. And I'm going to skip this slide and go to the next one because the next one's more important. So the model for reflective teaching, this is a really wonderful model, and it's a model that I'm going to ask you to engage in twice in this semester, where you analyze some case studies that I'm going to give you. Those are 2 of your major assignments, and each one is worth, I think it's 15% each, if I can remember correctly. So it's going to be very important for you to take some time with this model and really read carefully on pages 22 and 23 and 24, Actually, 25 as well. There's a little bit there. So it's going to be very important for you to look at this and get your head wrapped around what it means to be a reflective teacher, and what one does, in looking at this. So reflection, information gathering, decision making, and evaluation. Example they give you, and this is the one that they analyze on those pages that I just noted. So Mrs. Newby is nervous about teaching and feels that she will not be able to handle student misbehaviors. How might she solve this problem using RIDE? So this is that reflective process of looking at a practice and coming up with some solutions, some decisions, and some evaluation. So I'm going to stop here just for a second and just I want to talk a little bit more about the RIDE. You will see here on page 23, there's a nice little graphic here where the person has reflected and has come up with 3 possible conjectures. And then for each one of those has done some information, proposed some information gathering, proposed some decision making, and proposed an evaluation. Read this really carefully. I want you to really understand how this works. And then when you turn to page 24, you'll see it written out in narrative form. And that's really what I'm going to ask you to do when your case studies is write it out in narrative form. I don't expect you to make a graph, although if that's useful to you as a sort of a beginning piece, you certainly can do that as well. So do spend some time with the ride. Okay, so let's just summarize what we've talked about today. What is educational psychology? What is critical thinking? And how does educational psychologists use theory and research? Research methods are popular. How can teachers and researchers narrow the gap between theory and practice? What is reflective teaching? And how does one become a more reflective teacher? And I think that's it, folks. I think that's the last slide. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. You'll also find a narration for Chapter 2 as well. So I hope this has been useful for you, and I'll be talking to you soon.